Watching News at Prime, let's quickly bring you this now. ANC Secretary-General Fikile Mbalula says the party will not be intimidated by the Democratic Alliance's threats of a motion of no confidence against President Cyril Ramaphosa. This comes after Ramaphosa fired the Trade, Industry and Competition Deputy Minister Andrew Whitfield. Mbalula says the party's National Working Committee will convene tomorrow to discuss the recent political developments. Let's take a listen to this, and it sets the basis for the conversation we're about to have.
If they propose a motion of no confidence, it means they then are out of the GNU. We will wait for when they want to do that, and then if they do that, then they are out of the GNU, and the ANC will deal with those matters. Tomorrow, we will reflect on these developments as the National Working Committee and decide what needs to be done. But it's vividly clear that we are behind the president, and at the same time, we are not moved by any threat, including ultimatums. Government is not run by ultimatums. If you respect each other, they must learn to speak properly through us, not through ultimatums.
All right, let's discuss this further. And we're joined now by former DA leader Tony Leon, who talks to us from America this evening. But I understand it is morning where you are in California. Thank you so much for making time to talk to us, Tony. Good to talk to you. Let's start with...
great chat.
Wonderful. Let's start with your reading of what's going on in the GNU right now. The president seems to have set the pigeon amongst, or a cat amongst the pigeons, as the saying goes. What's your reading of what's going on?
Absolutely. I think you can unpack a number of things. Now, obviously, as you mentioned the intro, I'm very far away, but I follow this quite closely since I have a little interest in it, since I was involved in the negotiations that led to the GNU just over a year ago. Look, if you're looking at the legalities and the logic of this, you're going to be very hard-pressed to come to a sensible conclusion. I mean, if Andrew Whitfield was in breach of cabinet's procedures by going overseas on a private trip, not a state-funded one, in February 2025 without the president's permission, why did the president wait 4 months to dismiss him, which he did last week or this week? The second part is, if the DA's ultimatum, as Fikile calls it, amounts to saying we withdrawing from the national dialogue because it's a waste of money, which I think it is, incidentally, but that's a secondary matter. Why did the DA only decide it was a waste of money on Saturday? Why wasn't it a waste of money on Thursday? And ditto, the DA said, well, we're going to oppose budget votes of corrupt ministers or ministers who are implicated in corruption. Why did that only happen on Saturday? Why were they going to vote in favor of them on Thursday or Friday? So the logic of it is one thing, or the legality, but the politics of it, I think, is the essence. And there is, obviously, and I'm not saying anything that isn't glaringly apparent, there's a breakdown of trust between the parties, and perhaps that's been so right from the beginning. It certainly was already evident that clues were salted during the negotiations last year, which I was involved in June. And secondly, there's a difference of framing. For the DA, logically and politically, it sees the GNU as a partnership or a coalition. From the ANC point of view, they see the GNU as an ANC initiative in which you can be a supplicant or you can sup at the table, but you have no say in the direction of travel of the government vehicle. And those, frankly, if we were to use the language of a divorce lawyer, are irreconcilable differences. And they can only be reconciled if there's a fundamental reset, if there's a kind of intake of breath and saying, well, so far we haven't succeeded, we've got to have a conversation. And frankly, in my view, before there's a national dialogue, which Cyril Ramaphosa and the ANC have punted as the panacea for our problems, there should actually be an internal dialogue within the government of national unity as to whether they're on the same page or indeed they are irreconcilables and they must each go their own way. That's just how I see it from where I am.
All right. We'll talk about what a reset would look like in your view. But before we get there, there appears also to be internal wranglings from within the Democratic Alliance. If you read the Sunday Times today, suggestions being made that there were those who were for the DA leaving the GNU altogether, but it would appear John Steenhuisen and his faction, if we can use that expression, won the day, and therefore they will stay within the GNU, but they will make life difficult for Ramaphosa's government, as Helen Zille would have it. In your view, is that something that is going to damage the DA? How do you think this is looking to their constituency?
Well, I think that's a very interesting question. Let me just say the DA is a democratic organization. It's not the Communist Party of North Korea. So I think it's absolutely appropriate that there should be an internal, robust debate on something as monumental as do we stay in the government of national unity or do we leave it? And what are our options? I think you've got to have a proper discussion about that. If there wasn't, I would be very concerned about the actual health of the party as a democratic institution. So I don't see that as a problem. I think the question you ask is a fundamental one. So there are almost two contradictory truths that are thrown out just from the polls that I've seen. The one truth is people say it's much better for the DA to stay in the government almost under any circumstances, because the alternative is if the DA leaves, you get the EFF or some radical populist party coming in. And I think for a lot of folk who vote for the DA, and just looking at the polls that I looked at, that would be the worst alternative. And then there are a lot of people who say, look, you've so compromised as a party by being in the government, you've been tagged along with decisions, with legislation you don't agree with, you've taken collective responsibility for a whole agenda that goes against your political value system. You should get out. And in a way, people want both. I think, and I really can't put myself into the mind of the ordinary DA supporter because I led the party for a number of years, so right. Slightly different. But I am actually a supporter, just an ordinary supporter of the party these days, never mind what I once did. And I would say there's a contradiction that both truths are held by supporters of the party. They don't want the EFF in government, and they think that if the DA stays there, that's a blocking mechanism against the EFF, which is essentially a negative attribute. And then on the positive side, they want the DA to behave like the DA always behaved when I was the leader, which is as an opposition party. So in a way, the DA is half in and half out. It's half in government and half in opposition. And that's why you've got all these moves that the DA has currently announced to vote against certain departmental budgets. And you've also got court cases that they bring against legislation they disagree with. So that's on the DA side. From the ANC side, for all the difficulties that the DA brings to the government, which are manifest, and you heard Fikile responding right now about ultimatums and so on. Actually, just from my viewpoint, it's far easier for the ANC to deal with the DA as a partner in government than it will be if the EFF and the NK, because the DA is actually not saying we want to take over the ANC. They're not saying we want Cyril Ramaphosa to be replaced by Paul Mashatile. Those are not the demands, the political demands of the DA. If the DA exits the government and a party like the EFF or NK comes in, or indeed if the ANC limps along vote by vote as a minority government, which is kind of deeply unstable for the country and its economy and its investor climate, then actually I think the ANC is going to have even more problems. So we are not in the land of, good versus bad here. I think we're in the land of worse and less worse, in my opinion, from the overall governance point of view, never mind the party interest.
It would appear, though, Tony Leon, that instability is going to be the order of the day if the DA is going to make life difficult, particularly for the ministers that they see as corrupt. They are not going to participate in those, in supporting their budget votes. And by the way, those budget votes by departments are going to take place this coming week. Surely that is going to be a destabilizing factor. If you look at how the budget was dealt with, that was very destabilizing. So how stable is this GNU with this cooperation, if you want to call it that, between the DA and the ANC?
I think it's very fraught, and clearly there's a huge logical contradiction. I mean, how are you in government and you're going to vote against departmental budgets. It's one thing to support the overall budget fiscal framework, but you are collectively responsible for the entirety of government, which includes all those ministries that you might be opposing the votes on. So I just don't see this thing as it now is continuing into the indefinite future. Something's got to give, as they say in the movies. And I'm not sure what it is. Absent a fundamental reset and absent a heart-to-heart conversation between Cyril Ramaphosa and John Steenhuisen and saying, well, hang on, we're on the brink here. How do we get back from it? If they want to pull back from it, I obviously can't see into the minds of either of those people. I might have a slightly better idea of the one side's mind, but not currently, because I'm not there. But I think, you've got to ask, let's just go back to the immediate trigger point. I mean, it's a bit like saying, when Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated, that caused the First World War. Well, it did, but there were a whole lot of other causes that created in June 1914 the explosion of war across the whole of Europe and the wider world. So Andrew Whitfield is fired by President Ramaphosa during the week for going on a private trip to America without permission in February. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, why did President Ramaphosa wait 4 months to fire him? And what is in his mind? Clearly, I mean, this is a trivial matter that triggered this government crisis. Now, you can make the assumption, and it's simply an assumption, that what Ramaphosa is trying to do is to say, well, I've acted against a DA deputy minister, and now I'm going to act against a number of corrupt ANC ministers, such as, for example, Simelane and Minister in Kabani, who have been framed in a lot of very improper activities. So the question is, did he do that in order to clear the decks for taking action against his own colleagues, or did he do it to crack the whip and tell the DA, now you must respond to this because I'm showing you who's in charge, who's boss of the class here? Don't know the answer to that. But in either event, and a lot of people say the president's a master tactician, he must have game planned that the consequences for what he's done are going to be severe. And we assume that he did it with some purpose. But so far, other than the basic explanation of a breach of travel protocols, we don't really know. So to some extent, we are dancing in the dark here.
Final question, Tony. I'm letting you go. The DA says we are not going to get out of the GNU. If anyone is going to push us out, it must be the president. I'm now coming to the question around the motion of no confidence. Now, it does appear to be a point that the DA wants to, at some point, bring about. But do you think that that is actually, it will never come, the motion of no confidence? Because if the DA says we are not going anywhere, we are sitting put until someone pulls the trigger, is that a moot point, this motion of no confidence?
Well, I think at the moment it's a moot point, but it's a kind of threat that's been kept in reserve. So if the DA gets thrown out of government, then presumably immediately they'll trigger the motion of no confidence against the president. That's, I imagine, what the game plan is. And I'm really speaking without inside information here. But look, I think what the DA is trying to do, and you can argue whether it's a clever or a silly thing to do, is to say, you must fire us because we don't want to bring down the government as it's currently constituted. So it's in a way sorting out the blame game. So we won't walk because then our supporters, the markets, all the backers will say, you caused the government to collapse. But if you fired from the government, well, you can plausibly and correctly say, we want to stay, but we were removed, even if the conditions of staying made it impossible in reality for the government to continue as a current year. So I think there's an anticipation of who's going to be blamed. But if the DA walks out or gets kicked out, let's say, because that seems to be the strategy, I can't see anything other than it being followed by a motion of no confidence against the president, because presumably they won't have confidence in the president who's removed their ministers from government, and that would be a logical moment to strike. So I think it's being held in reserve as a weapon to be used in the future, if it in fact can be effectuated, because obviously you've got to get 50% or plus one of all MPs to back it. And I don't know what the parliamentary arithmetic is going to amount to at that point, but it's possible.
Tony Leon, thank you very much, allowing us to
Thank you
interrupt
so much.
your holiday. Thank you.
Thank you.
Talking to us from California in the United States.